right, this section, Chapter 1, Section B, is solving equations with complex numbers. Guys, complex numbers have what in them? What have we been talking about that's been different? They have i's, they have imaginaries. So when we solve equations, now you can get i's underneath the square root. You can solve equations that have complex solutions and stuff by taking the square root of both sides. You can solve by completing the square. You can solve using the quadratic formula. What you cannot solve by is factoring. Does anybody know why? If you solve an equation by factoring and you get two answers, what kind of answers are they? Are they real? Yes. We're talking about complex solutions, which are what? Imaginary. So factoring only works if the solutions are real. The other ways of solving work whether they're real or imaginary. So none of these will say solve by factoring because factoring won't work. So later on in the year, standardized test, you guys have an equation and it says to solve. The first thing you should try to do is factor, and if it doesn't, use these other methods. But for what we're doing right now, in this section of what's going to be on your quiz, you're not going to be able to factor it. None of them will work. So again, I'm going to go through a couple different ways to solve the problems. You guys can do whatever you want, but you have to figure out the most effective way. The quadratic formula will work every single time, but it's not the quickest. So we need to make sure that we are being efficient when we solve, because if not, you guys are going to run out of time, which I think is happening to some of us. So let's talk about this. All right, there's two ways that I could go about solving number one. I could write out x minus 2 times x minus 2, right? FOIL it out, move the 20 over, then use the quadratic formula or completing the square. You absolutely could do that. It's just a little more time consuming. But if you have a binomial that is squared and it's all by itself, what can we do to both sides here? We could take the square root, watch. So if I take the square root on both sides, I have x minus 2 equals, what goes in front of my negative 20? Plus or minus, good. And I'm going to separate this now to negative 1 times 4 times 5. Somebody asked me last period, do I have to do that? No, I'm not telling you have to. I just think it's a good idea that you remind yourself there's a negative 1 underneath there, so when I take it out, there's an I. Because if you leave the I off of your answers, guys, it's a major, major deal. You're telling me something's real when it's really imaginary. So as we simplify it on the right-hand side, I have my x minus 2 equals plus or minus. What can I take out from that square root? The I, and what else? A 2, okay? So I'm going to take out an I and a 2. So when I simplify this, this becomes plus or minus 2i square root of 5. And then what is my next step? You're going to add the 2. So I'm going to say plus 2, and you get x equals 2 plus or minus 2i square root of 5. Now, if you would have gone from the beginning, multiplied x minus 2 times x minus 2, moved the 20 over, you would have come out with x squared minus 4x plus 24. You would see it doesn't factor, so then you would either complete the square or use the quadratic formula. Again, we'd get the same answer, but this is the most efficient way to get there. Saves the most amount of time. All right, so let's look at number 2. Same situation here, right? A binomial by itself set equal to a number. What should we do? Take the square root. Good. So I have 3x minus 1 equals plus or minus, break this up, negative 1 times 16 times 3. You want to try to find the biggest perfect square and smallest non-perfect square. So what can I pull out from underneath my radical? I can take out an I here, and I can take out a 4. So I have 3x minus 1 equals plus or minus 4i square root of 3. Guys, you have to follow order of operations here. Some people on your test, when you got to a point like this, you divided by 3 and then added 1. Is that the correct way to do it? No, what do we have to do? You have to add 1 first. So 3x equals 1 plus or minus 4i root 3. And then do what? Then we divide by 3. So x equals 1 plus or minus 4i square root of 3 over 3. WebAssign wants it split, right? 1 over 3 plus 4i root 3 over 3, and 1 minus, or 1/3 minus 4i over 3, right? You don't have to do that. For me, for your quiz, just leave it. All right, so we come to a problem like this. The first thing we should try to do, not on your quiz because we know that we're going to have i's in it, but in general, for future reference, you should try to factor. This one doesn't. So you can do one of two things. You can either use the quadratic formula or you can complete the square. Either way, you'll get the same answer. Why do I think completing the square is probably not your best bet here? What is your b term? 1. What would you have to do to complete the square? You take the b term and do what? Divided by 2. So then we'd be using fractions, and you guys don't love that. So let's just go ahead with the quadratic formula. A equals 1, b equals 1, and c equals 5. Yeah? So x equals negative b, negative 1, plus minus b squared. So 1 squared minus 4 times a is 1, times c is 5, all over 2 times 1. So as we simplify, I get negative 1 plus or minus. What is 1 squared? 1. Minus 4 times 1 times 5? 20. Good. All over 2. So negative 1 plus or minus. Guys, what's 1 minus 20? Negative 19. As soon as you see that negative, what should we be thinking? Imaginary. It's negative 1 plus or minus. If you write it out, negative 1 times 19 over 2. Are there any hidden perfect squares in 19? No. So I have negative 1. What is the square root of negative 1? I. That comes out. And then I have 19 over 2. Would have gotten the same answer if you did completing the square. Just not as easy because your b term. All right, look at this. For future reference, guys, don't get tricked on something like this. Are there factors of 10 that multiply to give you 10 but add to give you 3? A lot of people went, oh yeah, 5 and 2. Well, 5 and 2 give you a positive 10 when you multiply and a positive 3 when you add. No. So you have to be careful, especially on a multiple choice test. If you guys saw that, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's the right answer. Signs were going to mess you up, so make sure you're paying attention. Quadratic formula or completing the square here? Quadratic, okay. So a equals 1, b equals 3, and c equals 10. So x equals negative b, so negative 3, plus or minus b squared minus 4 times 1 times c, which is 10, all over 2 times 1. So as we simplify, negative 3 plus minus, what's 3 squared? 9. What's 4 times 1 times 10? Good, so 9 minus 40 over 2. So negative 3 plus or minus the square root of what? What kind of 31, guys? Negative. Makes a big difference whether it's negative or positive. So when we go to simplify this, it's really negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 1 times 31 over 2. So what can I take out of there? The I. Negative 3 plus minus I root 31 over 2. You guys have done the quadratic formula 100 times in your life. More than that, I'm sure. This is the same thing, just we have to pay attention to a negative underneath the radical. You guys with me? You good? Okay, for examples. What is the difference? How is this one different? How is number 5 different? What's it missing? Okay, it doesn't have a parenthesis. Good. What's your A value? Okay. What's your B value? 0. You don't have an x to the first power. And then your C value is 25. So you can approach this one of two ways. You can use the quadratic formula. You just have to use B as 0. Or since you don't have a B term, you have an x squared and a constant, you can isolate the x squared. If we isolate the x squared, what happens with 25? Okay, we're going to subtract it from both sides. So I have x squared equals negative 25. How do I solve this? Take the square root, good. What goes in front of your answer? plus or minus. Think about this. It's negative 1 times 25. What is coming out of that radical? 5i. If you have a question, very simple question like that, and you tell me the answer is plus or minus 5, that is a huge chunk of points off because a negative underneath the square root means it's an imaginary number. If you guys forget the plus or minus, which a lot of you did on your test, that's also a big mistake because how many answers should you have for this question? 2. If you tell me it's just 5i, you're missing half of the answer. So just little stuff like that, pay attention to. Okay, again, what are the 2 methods I can use here? Completing the square or quadratic formula. I'm going to use completing the square just to show you a little different way to do it. And why would this be not so bad to complete the square? Because your b term is even. So x squared plus 2x plus my square equals, when I move 9 to the other side, what happens? Negative 9, awesome, plus your square. Good job. So process of completing the square, we take our b term and we divide it by 2, which gives me what number? 1. So on the left-hand side of my equal sign, what does my binomial look like? X plus 1, quantity squared. Good. And then how do I figure out what goes in each of those boxes? You square this. So 1 here and 1 here. Negative 9 plus 8 is, negative 9 plus 1 is, and negative 8. Now this is a problem that we've done 100 times. We did already 2 of them or 3 in our examples. What do I do to both sides? Take the square root, good. So I have x plus 1 equals plus or minus, don't forget. I'm going to go ahead and break 8 up. Negative 1 times 4 times 2. What can I take out? 2 and an I. Good. Can't see that. Take out 2i. So I have x plus 1 equals plus or minus 2i squared to 2. And then what's your last step? We're going to subtract 1. Perfect. So x equals negative 1 plus or minus 2i squared to 2. Did anybody do the quadratic formula? The thing that's great about using completing the square is your simplification will be done throughout the problem. It'll work itself out. If you did the quadratic formula, I think it comes out to be negative 2 plus minus 4i squared to 2 over 2, which, that's fine, but is that simplified? No, you would have to take out a 2, and then you'd be left with negative 1 plus minus 2i root 2 over 2, and then cancel the 2's. So again, that's fine if you do it that way. It's just an extra step. All right, last 2. All right, let's think about how we attack this problem. What's your A value? 25. What's your B value? And what's your C? 9. If you don't have a B value, what's your best bet to do? Yep, let's isolate x squared. So the first thing I'm going to do, Eden said, was subtract 9. Perfect. So 25x squared equals negative 9. Do not take the square root right here, guys. You have to get x squared by itself. So what do? Divide by 25. Now that x squared is so low, we can do that. Take the what? Yep, take the square root. This is the same thing as saying the square root of negative 9 over the square root of 25. So think about this, negative 1 times 9. So x equals plus or minus. What is the square root of negative 9? 3i. What's the square root of 25? 5. You can write that a couple different ways. You could write plus minus 3/5 I. You could write it like I did it at first with the I in the numerator. Or you could write it I 3 over 5. I think that looks weird. Do not put the I in the denominator. Is it in the denominator? No. Cannot be. Good. All right. Last one. 2 options here. We could write x minus 1 twice, FOIL it, distribute the 3 in, move the 16 over, then complete the square or quadratic, or what can we do? Okay, let's isolate our binomial first. I like that you guys said that. Divide both sides by 3. So x minus 1 squared equals negative 16 over 3. Now that my binomial squared is all by itself, what can I do? Take the square root. Good. So guys, x minus 1 equals, this is plus or minus, this is the square root of negative 16 over the square root of 3. Remember that. So the square root of negative 16 is negative 1 times 16. What does that simplify to? Perfect. 4i over what? Square root of 3. Is that okay? Can I just go ahead and add 1 to both sides? No, we cannot have radicals in the denominator, and you cannot have i's in the denominator. Please, please, please don't forget that. I'm going to rationalize top and bottom by square root of 3. So I have x minus 1 equals plus or minus 4i square root of 3 over 3, correct? And then my last step, add the 1. So when I write my answer, ladies and gents, I have x equals the whole number 1 plus or minus 4i square root of 3 over 3. My entire numerator is not over 3. You could write it, if you wanted to, as 3 plus minus 4i root 3 over 3, couldn't you? If you wanted to write it over the same denominator, how would you make 1 whole into thirds? 3 over 3. But you don't have to. You could leave it just like this. But understand this is not equivalent to either of those two. What I have circled or boxed out is the same. This is not. That 1 is a whole number, and then it's plus or minus the fraction. We okay? All right, there is a quiz review. It's 20 questions. The solutions are there. I will work them all out, and I'll post the video. There's also a class kick. I'm not going to do the class kick video until I know for sure that there's no school Thursday. If there is school on Thursday, then that's what we're going to be doing in class. Okay, I'll give you guys your test back in just a second.